Doctors of Reddit, what patient made you go, how the FK are you even alive? As a med student on my emergency rotation, I had a guy brought in who had fallen off a 7th or 8th floor balcony and landed on his head. Essentially DOA, and we couldn't get a blood pressure when he got to the hospital. As a student, my job was to basically stand to the side and squeeze the bajillion bags of blood that went into this dude. His cervical spine was essentially dust on the initial CT scan we got. I figured he probably wouldn't have made it, but about a month later I'm now on my ICU rotation and I see this guy awake and conscious. Pretty crazy. Any update on his condition? Crazy. When I last saw him we were basically seeing how much function he would get back, but he was going to be in the ICU for a long time. From what I can remember, he couldn't really move either leg, but he actually had some movement in his arms, hands, so they weren't sure how much he was going to get back by the time he left the hospital. That's insane nonetheless. Airlifted pregnant female with GSW to the head. Arrived intubated and non-responsive with the bullet lodged in her right occipital lobe. Self-extubated the next day and left the hospital against medical advice 2 days after that with only minor visual deficits. Unbelievable. She was no lady. She is a Terminator. More badass than a Terminator. She was Sarah Connor. Actually, this makes sense. Pregnant with John. She gets shot in the head by a Terminator. She then flees the hospital before it tracks her down. Did she still have the bullet in her when she left? Belligerent guy comes in a wheelchair. He doesn't want to be here. He's FG fine. The party was good. M's FD his evening up. M's brought him in from a bush party. The guy had a chainsaw stuck in his thigh and shin. Literally jammed in his leg. And severe burns after falling into the bonfire on half his body. Guy was hammered. Didn't seemed bothered by the fact he was severely burned or had a chainsaw in his leg. He ended up losing the leg below his knee. And got a nasty infection from the burn. But still, if his leg wasn't completely FD, I am convinced he'd have gotten up and tried to fight people. So not the doctor but the patient. I had a super bad allergic reaction that was a specific type of allergic reaction that was deadly on its own. It would have been deadly if I had only taken a small bit of the medicine I was allergic to, but the doctor that prescribed it accidentally prescribed about 10x more than what the maximum dose for that medication is supposed to be. So not only was I super allergic, I was also overdosed on what L was allergic to. So that led into weeks of me being in the ICU and doctors thinking I had about a 3% chance of surviving at best. Every time I was conscious and had family visiting, a doctor would tell me to make the most of it because I probably wasn't going to make it for their next visit. Eventually I somehow recovered, but for about 2 years after I was still regularly going to several doctors to make sure different things were okay that were affected by it. Every single doctor I went to would hug me and would have other doctors and nurses come in and say something like, "Hey, you don't remember this because you were unconscious at the time, but I helped restart your heart," or "I was the person that vacuumed the blood and pus out of your throat that was blocking your air path," and they were just all amazed that I made it. It's been about 8 years since it all went down, and I've run into several of the doctors and nurses around the city and they still recognize me and still hug me. It amazes me how in such a large city with such a huge hospital that gets the most extreme medical cases from around the world that they still remember me being there. What happened to that first doctor? Just prescribing a medicine the patient allergic to or telling them to take 10x the dose are bad enough. But he did both. I'm guessing you got a massive malpractice settlement out of that. 10x the maximum safe dose is a bit careless. I was on home call for in a small town. Got a call from the nurse one night and she was like, "M's brought someone in here and they think she might be dead." I was like, "Well, is she?" She was like, "I don't know." This was a seasoned RN. By the way. So I was like, "Well, guess we're treating this as a code blue kind of situation." So without any further information, I jump into my car and rush over to the hospital. Once I got there, I realized why the triage nurse was so confused. In the trauma bay lay what appeared to be skeletonized remains under a blanket. The person felt warm to touch. So I opened their eye. And a yellow, wrinkled, shrunken eyeball stared at me and then suddenly moved. Potassium of 1. For those familiar with lab values. The backstory was extreme self-neglect, depression combined with caregiver neglect. Weighed in at 67 pounds at a height of about 5 feet 5 inches. We actually resuscitated her. Very aggressively. And unbelievably. After about 8 liters of fluid. She started speaking a word or two at a time and recognized her daughter. For those like me who are curious. Potassium levels of 3. 6 to 5. 2 is normal. Anything less than 2. 5 is life-threatening. Seems like a relatively wide range for normal. But it doesn't take much to get into deadly territory. That's kind of scary. I'm going to go eat a banana. I had to have 4 bags of potassium pumped into my veins once in recess. Was the most painful thing I can remember. They tied my hands down to stop me pulling the IV tubes out. They also kept trying to get me to drink it. It's gross. I was about to comment the same thing before I saw yours. Holy St. One time I was getting potassium pumped into me and the nurse had left the room. The pain was getting worse and worse by the second and my call button was out of reach. I was crying and on the verge of screaming and ripping my IV out when the nurse came back. It feels like fire is being pumped into your veins. Currently in residency. But this was a patient I saw in medical school. This one has more to do with a patient's past medical history instead of anything acute. Had one patient in one of my internal medicine rotations who was admitted for hip surgery who was one of the nicest, sweetest people I've ever met. Her surgery was pretty routine and there were no complications. In her past medical history, she was diagnosed with stage 4 endometrial cancer that had spread to her brain. Apparently she had undergone chemo, radiation, primary tumor resection, and surgery to remove the brain met. She remained cancer-free since that period. The fact that she had undergone that whole ordeal and appeared to be mostly healthy and was in remission from her cancer really blew my mind. Not a doctor but a registered nurse. Last summer between the months of June to September we had a young male, 19 years old, who crashed his motorcycle and was sent flying through a van's windshield. By the time he came onto my unit he had gone through so many operations and I heard he needed to have over 100 blood transfusions within the first month to keep him alive. He also ended up losing all movement and sensation from the belly button down as well as losing his left arm. His right arm was intact but barely functioning. Neurologically he was with it. Knew his name and that he was at the hospital, but I honestly don't think he knew what happened to him. His family members were very nice and I could only imagine how they were feeling. I honestly have no idea how he was still alive. He couldn't sit up straight anymore because he would be in terrible pain 24/7, but if we laid him flat he couldn't really clear his secretions. I'm surprised he didn't get pneumonia or aspirated or something else. We discharged him to a long-term acute care facility and that's the last I heard of him, but it's just such a sad story considering he's only 19. What a tragic story. I had a patient in the emergency room who had been involved in an awful car accident where firefighters and paramedics spent an hour trying to get him out of his car. Reportedly, he attempted to walk to the ambulance and when he arrived he was awake and talking. Confused speech. But still. Then paramedics signaled the back of his head to me. His skull was popped open on the back so much that I could see inside. We paged the brain surgeon immediately and the patient was taken directly to the operation theater. Months later I heard from my colleague that he was still alive and had no damages other than some occasional balance problems. I was very early in. This kid hit up a convenience store near the hospital where I was working. Killed 2 people. One a kid. He had been beat to St. shot, and wrecked his car, thanks to the magic of CCTV and video monitors. It was all recorded. That was his last free day. My job was to get him in and out. We go him up and running. And the real hard part was seeing a 19-year-old realizing life as he knew it was over. I'm not a doctor, but I did meet a patient who fell from a 5-story building. Landed on his upper back. Woke up in the hospital the next morning and got up walking around like nothing ever happened. Barely a scratch on him. Think about it every time I'm in a building with at least 5 stories. Just looking down like how in the world did this guy walk away from that like he fell off his bike and took a nap? Actually, I've seen worse injuries from someone falling off a bike lol. Upper back? Might have used proper breakfall technique and taken only a fraction of the impact force he would have otherwise. Falling from 5 stories, how did his head not smack the pavement? Tucked his chin as hard as possible and got very lucky. Lady in her mid-30s was in the clinic for a 1-week follow-up post-foot amputation. Diabetes. She was admitted straight from the clinic because her blood glucose was 600 mg per deciliter. Normal is 80 to 120. And the wound was severely infected. We used super concentrated doses of insulin to bring it back to the 200s. She was on strict diet restrictions and we couldn't figure out how it wouldn't drop any lower than 250. Turns out her kids, teens, had been sneaking giant 64-ounces sodas and candy bars into the hospital. Literally 1 week after we chopped her foot off because of uncontrolled diabetes. Not exactly a case of how the FK did you survive that trauma disease, but how the FK do you even function on your own? Quote, I know a guy who keeps telling me that he never takes insulin and drinks 40 ounces of dew a day and his diabetes hasn't caused him any problems yet. Same guy also had his foot amputated a few inches above the ankle a year ago. I don't understand. Does he think the amputation was for frostbite? Termites. Pesky buggers. I work in an in Lebanon where the construction safety regulations are a bit lax. A few years back I remember that construction workers were falling off buildings like dominoes. One guy came in having fallen from a few stories up and got impaled by an iron bar that went through the back of his neck and out of his left eye socket. Guy was alive and talkative when he got to our rushed down to surgery. Apparently it had missed every vital structure somehow and the guy didn't even lose vision in his eye. My blood sugar was greater than 1,000 when I was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. I was less than a year old. My mom had taken me to the doctor's office 4 times in 3 days, but the nurse called her a nervous mother and sent her home. Also diagnosed with Addison's disease a couple years ago. I'd probably had it for months. And had been living on my own in a town where I knew nobody. The day I got home I basically had a conscious blackout. Happened a few more times over the next couple weeks and I lost the ability to sense low blood sugars. When I was finally hospitalized I was in Addisonian crisis. Took them 3 days to bring in an endocrinologist. And he knew what was wrong within minutes. They told me my heart would have stopped within a week due to low sodium, high potassium. A guy the first took care of during my residency. FG Cyborg. I was the chief on trauma. Got a page about a patient en route with a stab wound to the chest. When the patient rolled into the trauma bay, he had no pulse. He had been stabbed in his left upper chest, 3 centimeters below clavicle. He got an orthoracotomy. If you want to feel like a badass, then do an orthoracotomy. We were able to cross-clamp his aorta. We took him right to the OR. We oversewed 1 small artery below his rib. Then transported him to the ICU still intubated. 8 hours later he was extubated and wanting breakfast. Seriously. Dude. He was dead 10 hours before. He was also a complete AE. No wonder someone stabbed him. Nurse turns to the doctor. Can we unsave this one? Quote. Where's the unsave button? The neck. Gotta give it a good twist though. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more videos.